James Carter was no stranger to the weight of the world on his shoulders. At 72 years old, his body carried the marks of time, gray hair, a few more wrinkles than he would have liked. But his spirit was unbroken. His strides were measured, confident, and each step carried with it decades of experience in navigating a world that often didn't want him there. Today, he walked through the heart of the city, heading toward a place he had heard about many times but never visited, La Bellevue, a restaurant that had become the talk of the town. La Bellevue was known for its luxury, its exclusivity, and its reputation as the go-to dining spot for the city's elite. It had been a symbol of wealth and power for years, frequented by politicians, business moguls, and celebrities. The kind of place where appearances mattered above all else, and where the entry of certain people was, at best, discouraged. James knew the type of people who had built this city on the backs of those like him, and often never saw beyond their own reflections. But James wasn't here for the power, the prestige, or the society of the rich. He was here simply because he wanted a nice meal. Something simple, a moment of quiet in his otherwise hectic life. And he believed that, in a world where everyone had a place, his place was just as valid as anyone else's. He reached the entrance of La Bellevue, the glass doors gleaming in the soft light of the evening. The moment he pushed the door open, he was greeted by the delicate strains of classical music floating from the speakers, adding to the restaurant's air of exclusivity. The interior was sleek, with dark wood paneling and soft, ambient lighting that cast a warm glow over the well-dressed patrons seated at their tables. There was a sense of calm in the air, the kind that comes with wealth, a calm that, for once, James felt he had the right to be a part of. But before he could even take a step further into the restaurant, a young man, sharply dressed in a suit, appeared in front of him. The manager, James assumed. The man's smile was polite, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, almost dismissive. "Good evening, sir," the manager said, his tone smooth but carrying an undertone of authority. "I'm afraid this isn't a place for people like you." James paused, taken aback by the suddenness of the comment. He looked up at the man, trying to make sense of the words. The manager's gaze swept over James from head to toe, sizing him up with a barely concealed air of superiority. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him like that, but the audacity to say it out loud caught James off guard. "I beg your pardon?" James asked quietly, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "This restaurant is a private establishment," the manager continued, barely acknowledging the question. "We cater to a very specific clientele. I'm afraid you won't be able to dine here." James could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he didn't allow himself to react. He had been called worse, heard worse. It wasn't the first time that his presence had been questioned, his mere existence dismissed. He knew exactly what this was, but today he would not let it pass without a word. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," James said, his voice still calm. "I came here for a meal, nothing more." The manager's smile wavered, but he remained unyielding. "This is a high-end restaurant, sir. Not a place for—" He hesitated, then finished. "For people like you." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't the food he wanted anymore. It wasn't the meal he had been hoping for. It was the principle, the sheer audacity of the man standing in front of him, who thought he could dictate who belonged and who didn't. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him now, their gaze piercing through the silence, watching this moment unfold. Not one of them spoke up. They simply watched, as if this was just another thing that happened. James was used to that, too. He wasn't angry at the people around him. He was just disappointed. "Look," James said after a moment, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm not here to fight. I'm just here to eat. But I won't stand for being treated like this." The manager, now clearly uncomfortable, glanced around at the other guests. He was losing control of the situation, and his mask of superiority was slipping. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his words more forceful now. James turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room once more. The grand chandelier, the polished tables, the hushed voices of the wealthy, they were all the same. The only thing that had changed was the man standing at the door. He stepped out of the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He took a deep breath, standing on the steps of La Bellevue, his hands resting at his sides. The city was alive around him, the noise of cars and voices echoing in the distance. But for James, the world had momentarily fallen silent. He had expected this. He had experienced this kind of rejection many times before, but it didn't make it any easier. Walking away from the restaurant, his thoughts drifted. He thought about all the times he had been told he wasn't good enough, not welcome enough, not deserving enough. And yet, he had worked hard his whole life. He had risen through the ranks of a world that had never made it easy for him. He had done everything that was asked of him, and more. And yet, here he was, once again reminded that for some, he would always be less than. As he walked down the street, James made a silent vow. This wasn't over. He would change this. He would make sure that no one else would ever feel like this again. James woke up the next morning with the quiet determination that had always been a part of him. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in his mind, but there was no room for bitterness in his heart. Life had shown him far worse, and this was just another instance in a long line of challenges. But something about it felt different, as if it wasn't just a personal insult. It was a message, a reminder that some things needed to change. He dressed slowly, deliberately, as he had done every day for decades. A simple button-up shirt, gray trousers, polished shoes. It was the kind of outfit that spoke of quiet confidence, of a man who didn't need to announce his presence. He was comfortable in his skin, no matter what others thought of him. As he ate breakfast, James's mind wandered. He thought of the city, of how it had always been a place of opportunity, but only for those who fit the mold. For those who didn't, like him, life was often a battle. But as the sun streamed through the window, he felt a spark of resolve. He had spent too many years bending to the will of others, swallowing insults and degrading comments. It was time for something different. That afternoon, James found himself standing in front of La Bellevue once again. This time, he wasn't just a man passing by, he had a purpose. He looked up at the grand building, at the enormous windows reflecting the wealth and elegance inside. It was the same place he had been turned away the night before. The memories of the manager's dismissive words still stung, but he had a plan now, a plan that would change things for good. He pushed open the door once again, the familiar chime of the bells above the entrance ringing in his ears. The atmosphere inside was as luxurious as ever, but today, James saw it differently. The polished floors, the elegant decor, it all felt like a facade, hiding the deeper truths that many were too afraid to acknowledge. He had every right to be here, just as much as anyone else. The manager who had turned him away the night before was standing at the front, his back turned as he spoke to a young woman in a crisp white blouse. The moment he saw James, his smile faltered. He recognized him immediately. "You again?" the manager said, his voice dripping with thinly veiled surprise. "Did you not understand last night?" "I understand perfectly," James replied, his voice calm but firm. "I was clear about what I wanted then, and I'm clear about it now. I'm here for a meal." The manager's eyes widened, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and indignation. "I told you last night, this is a private restaurant. We don't serve." James cut him off. "I know exactly what you said last night, but I'm not here to argue. I'm here to show you something." The manager took a step back, clearly uncomfortable. He was trying to regain control of the situation, but there was something in James's calm demeanor that threw him off balance. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone uncertain. Without another word, James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He held it out to the manager, who hesitated before taking it from him. The card was simple, black with gold lettering that read, "James Carter, owner, La Bellevue." For a moment, the manager stared at the card, unable to process what he was seeing. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It took several seconds for him to collect himself, and when he did, his face turned pale. You own this place," he stammered. James nodded. "I do. And after last night, I've decided to make a few changes." The room around them seemed to quiet, as if time itself had slowed down. The elegant patrons who had been chatting and eating their meals now looked up, their conversation stalling as they witnessed the exchange. James didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. His presence, his calm confidence, was enough to draw every eye in the room. The manager, clearly flustered, began to stammer, I didn't know. I had no idea who you were." James raised a hand to stop him. "It's not about who I am. It's about respect. The kind of respect that should be extended to every person, no matter their background, their appearance, or their wealth." The manager nodded quickly, his face a mixture of guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean... James held up the card once more, this time to a nearby waiter. "Please make sure I'm seated in the best spot in the house. I want to enjoy a meal, just like anyone else would." The waiter, his eyes wide with shock, didn't need to be told twice. He immediately led James to a table by the window, the best seat in the house. The manager, still standing frozen in place, watched helplessly as the scene unfolded in front of him. As James settled into his chair, he glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of several patrons. They, too, had witnessed the exchange, and the discomfort in their gaze was palpable. James wasn't sure if they were embarrassed for him or for themselves, but he didn't care. He was here, and he belonged here. The waiter placed a menu in front of him, and James scanned it casually. But it wasn't the food he was focused on anymore. It was the message he had sent. It was the change he had begun. As he sat there, waiting for his meal, James couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about one incident in a restaurant. This was about challenging the very systems that tried to silence people like him. People who had spent their lives fighting to be seen, to be heard, to take their rightful place in a world that had so often told them they didn't belong. James had come here for a meal, but what he had received was far more important. A lesson in the power of standing tall and claiming your space. James's meal came and went, the exquisite dishes nothing more than an afterthought to the monumental shift that had just occurred. As he finished his dessert, perfectly crafted chocolate mousse, He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the luxurious food that made him feel full, but the act of claiming his place in the world. He had done it without raising his voice or making a scene. It had been simple, direct, and undeniably powerful. But as he prepared to leave, a subtle tension hung in the air. The manager still hadn't approached him, and James wondered if he'd even muster the courage to face him. After all, the damage had already been done, and James had made it clear that his position was unassailable. However, before he could leave, the manager finally made his way over. His steps were tentative, hesitant, and his eyes refused to meet James's. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice low and strained, "I need to apologize for my behavior last night." James raised an eyebrow but remained silent, giving him the space to continue. I didn't realize who you were, and I should have known better than to judge you based on how you looked. I'm sorry." The manager's voice was a mixture of discomfort and genuine regret. James didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't an apology that felt as hollow as this one. The manager had done his job poorly, and now it was clear he was trying to salvage his own reputation. But James wasn't interested in an apology for the sake of it. It wasn't enough. "You should have known better," James said simply. "You should have treated me with respect from the start." The manager nodded rapidly, his face flushed with shame. "You're absolutely right, and I'll make sure this never happens again. I'll talk to the staff. Change the way we approach customers. You won't be treated like this again, I swear." James studied the manager for a moment longer before finally standing up. He didn't have time to entertain this conversation any longer. He had made his point, and now it was time for action. "Actions speak louder than words," he said coolly. "Don't just talk about change. Make it happen. You're in a position to do better. Don't waste it." The manager nodded again, seemingly on the verge of saying something more, but James had already turned toward the exit. There was nothing more to be said. James had done what he came here to do. He had proven that people like him belonged in spaces like La Bellevue, and now he would move on. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, and he inhaled deeply, letting the fresh breeze clear his thoughts. He didn't feel angry anymore. In fact, he felt relieved. The restaurant's response, or rather the lack of real change, wasn't something he could control. What he could control was how he carried himself, and that he knew was more than enough. Later that evening, after he returned home, James sat down at his desk, the place where he did his most important work. His business was thriving, his life was calm, and yet, in the back of his mind, something still didn't sit right. There had been a moment in the restaurant, a fleeting but significant moment, where he had realized the manager's apology wasn't really about him. It was about saving face. In fact, as much as he disliked it, James could see the potential for the situation to fade into a forgotten memory. The manager would likely return to his racist ways the moment James was out of sight. The restaurant's clientele would continue to be the same people who never had to face the systemic inequalities that still ran rampant in the city. The whole thing would simply blow over, and James's fight, his message, would be buried beneath the layers of privilege that ran this town. The more James thought about it, the more determined he became. He had made a dent, yes, but he wanted to make a change, a permanent one. The next morning, he woke early and decided to take action. He called a few of his old contacts in the business world, some of whom had a reputation for advocating for equality and social justice. It didn't take long before he had an idea. James would buy La Bellevue. It was an audacious thought, one that would change the restaurant's course completely. But he knew he had the resources and, more importantly, the resolve to do it. If people like him weren't welcome at places like La Bellevue, then he would make sure they had a place of their own. As he made calls and put his plan into motion, James couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. The kind of excitement that only came from knowing he was doing the right thing. La Bellevue wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol of exclusivity, of elitism, and of discrimination. But with a little bit of effort, James would turn that symbol on its head. He'd take the place that had tried to exclude him and turn it into something that reflected the city's true diversity. It would no longer be a beacon for those who thought they were better than others. It would be a space for everyone. As the days passed, James found himself consumed by the project. He met with real estate agents, spoke to investors, and drew up plans for what La Bellevue could become. But throughout it all, the manager's apology echoed in his mind. It was clear that while some things were changing, they weren't changing fast enough. James was determined to push harder. If he could change one place, he could change the world. James's plan to take ownership of La Bellevue was taking shape faster than he had anticipated. The real estate paperwork was filed, and the initial meeting with investors had gone better than expected. It seemed as though every piece was falling into place. Still, James knew that taking over the restaurant wasn't going to be an easy task. He'd need to dismantle the old structure completely and create something new, something that stood as a beacon for inclusivity rather than exclusion. As he drove to his office that morning, his mind raced. There were logistics to work out, renovations to oversee, and staff to hire. But more than that, there was a deeper purpose at play. He wanted to change the very culture of the place. He didn't just want to buy a restaurant. He wanted to reclaim it, to make it something that represented the values he had spent his entire life working to instill in his community: dignity, respect, and opportunity for all. That afternoon, he received a call from Marcus, one of his closest friends and an influential civil rights attorney in the city. Marcus had heard about James's plans and wanted to meet for lunch. "I heard what you're doing, James. This is big," Marcus said after the usual pleasantries. James smiled but felt the weight of the task ahead of him. "It's not just big, Marcus. It's necessary. There are too many spaces like La Bellevue where people who look like me don't belong. This is about more than just a restaurant. It's about making a statement." "Right," Marcus said. "But I've got to be honest with you. This is going to be harder than you think. You're not just fighting against one man's prejudice. You're going up against an entire system that profits off of exclusion." James leaned back in his chair. Marcus was right. What seemed like a small victory the other night was only the tip of the iceberg. He'd taken a stand, but now he had to figure out how to ensure that the change he sought would stick. "Do you think people will support it?" James asked. "They will," Marcus replied with conviction. "People are hungry for change. They're tired of the same old game where only the rich and the privileged get a seat at the table. You're making the right move, James. But you're going to need more than just a plan. You're going to need a community behind you." As they talked, James felt a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was used to fighting battles. And this, he realized, was his next fight. He'd made his name in business, but now it was time to make his mark on the world in a different way. The following days were a blur of meetings and plans. James worked closely with contractors to redesign the space. He wanted La Bellevue to be a place where everyone felt welcome, from the most sophisticated food critic to the everyday worker grabbing a meal after a long shift. The menu would reflect this vision. Dishes that fused high-end culinary techniques with flavors from diverse cultures. The decor would be elegant yet warm, a celebration of art from communities that were often overlooked in the world of fine dining. But as the restaurant's transformation began to take shape, James found himself faced with a new challenge: how to deal with the staff that had been in place before. He'd received reports that many of the employees were just as steeped in elitism and prejudice as the manager who had turned him away. He knew that some of them would have to go. But what about the others? What if they didn't share his vision? It would take more than just hiring the right people. He'd have to change the culture from within. James decided to meet with his new team one afternoon, before the restaurant's grand reopening. As he stood in front of the gathered staff, his presence commanded attention. There was no grand speech, no dramatic reveal. Instead, he began with a simple question: "Why do you want to work here?" The room was silent at first, as if the question was too simple to answer. Then one of the waiters, a young man with a nervous energy, raised his hand. "I want to work here because it's a prestigious place. It's a good opportunity," he said. James nodded. "Good, but that's not enough. What you need to understand is that this place isn't about prestige anymore. It's about offering something real to the people. It's about creating an environment where no one feels like they don't belong." The room grew quieter as the words sank in. Some of the staff exchanged uncertain glances, but James wasn't going to back down. This was his vision, and if they weren't on board, they didn't belong here. This restaurant isn't just about fancy food. It's about the people who eat it, the people who cook it, and the people who serve it. We have an obligation to make everyone who walks through that door feel like they belong here, he continued. If you can't get behind that, then you don't belong here either. As the meeting ended, there was a palpable shift in the room. Some of the staff members were visibly uncomfortable, but others seemed energized by the challenge ahead of them. For James, it was a step in the right direction. The old La Belle Vie had been a symbol of exclusion, but now it was becoming a place where everyone had a seat at the table. The days leading up to the restaurant's grand reopening were filled with excitement and anticipation. James could feel the momentum building, and it felt like the whole city was watching. But even as he stood on the edge of this new beginning, he knew there would be challenges ahead. The old ways wouldn't go down without a fight. And as the opening day approached, James couldn't help but think back to that moment when the manager had tried to turn him away. That moment of exclusion would always stay with him. But now, he had the power to change the narrative, not just for himself, but for everyone. The night of La Belle Vie's grand reopening had arrived, and the energy in the restaurant was palpable. James stood in the lobby, taking in the fresh, polished look of the space. Gone were the stark, cold walls. Instead, the room was filled with vibrant colors, rich textures, and artwork that celebrated Black culture, the local community, and the diversity of the world. The air was filled with the hum of anticipation as the first guests began to trickle in. The staff, all dressed in crisp uniforms, moved with practiced ease. But James could see the nervousness in their eyes. It was more than just opening a restaurant. It was about making a statement. Tonight, he would show the city, show everyone, that this was not just another high-end restaurant. This was a place for everyone. A place where people, no matter their background or skin color, could enjoy a beautiful meal without fear or judgment. James took a deep breath as he stood near the kitchen, watching the chefs work their magic. The menu was carefully crafted, a combination of sophisticated dishes inspired by global flavors and classic techniques, all served with an emphasis on inclusivity. There were Southern-inspired dishes, African stews, Caribbean flavors, and elegant French preparations. each dish a reflection of the diversity that James had always championed. As the restaurant began to fill, James made his rounds, greeting guests and thanking them for coming. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but there was also a sense of exhilaration. This was what he had fought for. This was what he had dreamed about for years. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol of change. But not everyone was convinced. As the night wore on, James noticed a few people who seemed uncomfortable with the shift in the atmosphere. They were quiet, reserved, an older couple seated at the corner table, their eyes scanning the room, their whispers carrying an air of disapproval. James had seen this before. They were the kind of patrons who only frequented places that felt exclusive, that catered to a very specific kind of person. He watched them for a moment, unsure whether to approach or let them enjoy their meal. But before he could make a decision, the restaurant manager, Thomas, approached him. Thomas had been with the restaurant for years, and despite the recent changes, James had decided to give him a second chance. Thomas was a good manager, but he had to adapt to the new vision, or leave. "James," Thomas began, his voice tense. "We have a problem. Table 5, they've requested to speak with you." James's gut tightened. He knew exactly what this was about. The couple at table 5 didn't look like they belonged here in their eyes. Not anymore. "Thank you, Thomas," James said, his voice steady. "I'll take care of it." He made his way to the table with a calm demeanor, though inside, he was bracing for the inevitable confrontation. When he reached the table, the couple was sitting back, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. They both looked up as he approached, their eyes sizing him up. "Good evening," James said, offering a polite smile. "I'm James, the new owner. How are you enjoying your meal?" The man, who appeared to be in his late 60s with a well-tailored suit and a stern expression, glanced up at James, his gaze lingering for a moment before speaking. "The food is fine," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "But I have to say, I'm a little surprised at the, changes you've made." James held his ground, his eyes meeting the man's without flinching. "What kind of changes do you mean, sir?" The woman, who had been silent until now, chimed in, her voice laced with condescension. "The atmosphere has changed. It's just different. This isn't the kind of place I'm used to. It's a bit too, shall we say, inclusive for our taste." James's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He knew where this was headed. This was about more than just the decor or the food. This was about the shift in power and who had a place at the table. "I understand that this might be different from what you're accustomed to," James said, his voice steady but firm. "But that's exactly what we're aiming for. La Bellevue isn't just about fancy dishes or an exclusive crowd. It's about creating a space where anyone, regardless of background or appearance, can come and feel welcome." The man narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated by James's response. "Well, I'm not sure that's the kind of thing we're interested in. We prefer places that uphold a certain standard." James took a moment before replying, weighing his words carefully. "I believe a true standard is one that welcomes everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from." The couple exchanged a glance, their displeasure evident. But James didn't back down. He had made a promise to himself and to the community that this restaurant would not cater to the exclusivity that had permeated its past. "I'm sorry this isn't the experience you were expecting," he continued, "but I think you'll find that La Bellevue's new vision is something that will resonate with more and more people as time goes on. I hope you can see the value in that." The couple sat in silence for a moment, and James could feel the weight of their judgment. But in the end, they didn't argue any further. They paid their bill and left, their exit as quiet and cold as their arrival. As James watched them leave, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They might not understand the change, and they might never agree with it, but that didn't matter. La Bellevue wasn't for them anymore. It was for the people who believed in what he was doing, the people who wanted something different. The rest of the evening went smoothly, and by the time the last guest left, James felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. The grand reopening had been a success, despite the challenges. As he stood in the empty restaurant, taking in the quiet hum of the kitchen and the soft light reflecting off the new, elegant tables, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few weeks after the grand reopening of La Bellevue were a whirlwind for James. The city's elite, the ones who had once dismissed him, began trickling through the doors of his restaurant. There were the familiar faces, the people who had once turned their backs on him when he was struggling, when they saw him as just another black man trying to make a name for himself. Now, they were back. They wanted a taste of the new La Bellevue, and they wanted to see how it had evolved. But not everyone was happy with the changes. As much as James had anticipated the initial resistance, he hadn't expected it to come in the form of public backlash. Whispers had spread, complaints from the old guard about the new direction of the restaurant. Some of the city's more influential food critics had published scathing reviews. They criticized the diversity of the menu, the eclectic decor, and the more relaxed atmosphere. They had all but written La Bellevue off, suggesting that it had lost its prestige in favor of a broader, more inclusive experience. James had expected criticism from some corners of society, but he had underestimated just how deep the divide ran. The backlash didn't just come from the older generation of diners. It was pervasive, cutting across different sectors of the city's elite social fabric. The whispers had turned into louder protests, with some former patrons saying they would never set foot in the restaurant again. Some had even begun to organize a boycott. The stress of it all was beginning to take a toll on James. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself it was just part of the process. But the constant stream of negative comments, the veiled slights from so many people who once claimed to be friends, it was beginning to wear him down. He found himself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the world pressing down on him. It didn't help that Thomas, the restaurant manager, seemed to be struggling with the change as well. Though Thomas had initially supported the new direction of La Bellevue, he had started to show signs of hesitation. He would speak to James in private, expressing concerns about the pressure they were under from the restaurant's critics. At one point, Thomas even suggested toning down the cultural aspects of the restaurant to make it more accessible to the traditional customers. James didn't say anything at first, but the suggestion stung. La Bellevue was meant to be bold, unapologetic, and proud of its roots. It wasn't meant to be accessible to people who couldn't see the beauty in diversity. He was determined not to bend to those who wanted him to water down his vision. The restaurant was a reflection of who he was, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. One evening, after a particularly difficult dinner service, James decided he needed to get away. He needed space to clear his mind, to reconnect with his purpose. He told Thomas he was taking a walk, and without a word, he stepped out into the cool night air. The streets of the city were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that felt ominous. It was as if the weight of the world had settled on this small corner of the city. James found himself walking toward the park near the restaurant, the familiar space offering him a sense of solace. It was a place he often visited when things got tough, when the pressure of being a black man trying to succeed in a predominantly white industry felt overwhelming. As he sat on a bench, watching the flickering streetlights and the occasional passerby. He thought about all that had led him here. The sacrifices, the moments of doubt, the times when he had considered giving up on his dreams altogether. But then, the thought of his grandmother, her strength, and the lessons she had passed down to him would flood his mind. She had always told him that change was hard, that the world wasn't going to just hand him anything. But she also taught him that he had a right to be here, to take up space, and to make his voice heard. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a text from his assistant, Sarah. "There's a meeting tomorrow morning with the board. They want to discuss the latest reviews and how to handle the situation moving forward. You should be prepared." James sighed. The board. He knew that some members had been growing restless with the growing controversy surrounding La Bellevue. There were whispers that they might even try to sell the restaurant if things didn't turn around soon. For a brief moment, the thought of letting it all go crossed his mind. But then, he remembered his purpose, remembered why he had started this journey in the first place. He wasn't just fighting for a restaurant. He was fighting for a place where people like him could stand tall, proud of who they were. He wasn't going to let that dream slip away. The next morning, James sat at the head of a long table, facing the board of directors. He could feel their eyes on him, some of them skeptical, others downright hostile. They were clearly anxious about the future of the restaurant, and James could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. James, the head of the board, a stern-looking woman named Margaret, began. "We need to talk about the direction this restaurant is heading. The recent reviews have been damaging, and we've lost several long-time patrons. Some of them are even talking about pulling their support altogether." James sat up straighter, meeting Margaret's gaze. He had prepared for this conversation. "I understand concerns," he said, his voice steady. "But I also believe in what we're doing here. La Bellevue isn't just about food. It's about creating a space for everyone. We can't go backward. We can't cater to the same crowd that has kept the status quo for so long." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what about the future of the restaurant? What do we do when the people who supported us for years are now turning their backs on us?" James paused, feeling the weight of her question. "We keep moving forward. We keep fighting for what we believe in. This restaurant isn't just a business. It's a movement, and it's a movement that's just getting started." The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed his words. Then, one of the younger members of the board, a man named David, spoke up. "I think he's right," David said. "La Bellevue is more than just a place to eat. It's about challenging the status quo. And I think it's worth fighting for." James nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. The tide might be turning, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. And this time, he wasn't about to back down. The days that followed the board meeting were filled with tension, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in the air at La Bellevue. Despite the lingering criticisms, James felt an odd sense of peace. It was as if the storm that had raged around him was beginning to calm, but he knew there were still rough waters ahead. The restaurant's future wasn't guaranteed. Nothing ever was. But for the first time in a while, James was sure of one thing. He had made the right choice. The patrons who continued to support La Bellevue were vocal about their loyalty. Some had posted glowing reviews online, while others took to social media, proudly sharing pictures of their meals and experiences. There was a resurgence in the restaurant's reputation, especially among the younger crowd, who were drawn to the inclusivity and authenticity that La Bellevue now represented. But with every triumph came a reminder of the battle still to be fought. James couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was waiting for him to falter. One evening, Just as the restaurant was beginning to fill with customers, James received a call that shook him to his core. It was from Sarah, his assistant, and her voice was tight with anxiety. "James, you need to hear this. There's been a protest outside the restaurant. It's getting ugly," she said. Without wasting a second, James hung up and headed straight for the front door of La Bellevue. When he arrived, the scene before him was nothing like he had ever imagined. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk outside, some holding signs with phrases like "back to tradition" and "no room for change." Others shouted slogans about the decline of good taste in the city's dining scene. James recognized several of the faces in the crowd. They were former patrons, regulars who had once eaten at La Bellevue every week. Now, they were protesting everything the restaurant had become. His heart sank. This was the kind of public outcry he had hoped to avoid. He had been bracing for something like this, but seeing it unfold before him was a different story entirely. He stood at the door for a moment, watching the crowd grow larger, their voices rising in anger and frustration. The irony of it wasn't lost on James. They were protesting a restaurant that had always been a part of their lives, a place where they had once dined in luxury, but now it was too much for them to handle. It wasn't just a menu that was changing, it was everything they believed in, and they weren't ready to accept it. But James wasn't going to let fear control him. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked outside to face the crowd. The moment he stepped onto the sidewalk, the noise seemed to grow louder. The protesters turned their attention to him, their eyes filled with scorn and judgment. A few of them shouted at him, accusing him of ruining the restaurant, of betraying everything that made La Bellevue special. James raised his hands, signaling for quiet. His heart raced, but he stood firm. "I understand that some of you are upset," he began, his voice calm but unwavering. "But this restaurant was never just about food. It was about a place where anyone, no matter their background, could come and feel welcome. I'm not trying to erase history, but I am trying to create something better, something that reflects who we are today, not who we were yesterday." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed like the protesters might quiet down. But then a man in the front of the crowd, someone James recognized as a regular customer from years ago, stepped forward. "You've lost your mind, James," the man spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't the place for people like you. You don't belong in a restaurant like this. You never did." The words hit James harder than he expected, but he refused to let them see his hurt. He knew exactly what the man meant. It was the same old story. The belief that someone like him didn't belong in spaces like La Bellevue. But James wasn't just a man they thought they knew. He was more than their narrow expectations. And if he had to fight for that, he would. "Let me make this clear," James said, his voice strong now. "I belong here. I belong in this city, in this restaurant, and in this world. And I'm not going anywhere. If you can't accept that, then maybe this isn't the place for you anymore." There was a moment of silence. Some of the protesters exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. James could feel their uncertainty. They had expected him to cower, to apologize, but instead he stood tall, unshaken by their venom. A few minutes passed before the crowd began to disperse, grumbling among themselves. The protest slowly died down, and the noise that had filled the air only moments before faded into the distance. As the crowd thinned, James returned to the restaurant, his steps heavy but resolute. He had just faced down his greatest challenge yet. But he wasn't done. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. He would have to keep proving himself, keep pushing against the expectations and prejudices that others tried to impose on him. But he was ready. The staff gathered inside, watching James with a mix of admiration and concern. Thomas was the first to approach him. "You okay?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. James gave him a small nod. "Yeah, I'm fine. This is just the beginning, Thomas. We've got a long road ahead." The manager smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the same determination that James felt. "We've got your back. All of us." James looked around at his team. The people who had believed in him from the start and felt a surge of gratitude. They were his support, his foundation. Together, they could weather anything. And just like that, James knew without a doubt that he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning after the protest was a quiet one. The sun had barely risen, and James stood by the large windows of La Bellevue, staring out at the bustling city streets below. The events of the previous day weighed on him, but instead of feeling defeated, he felt something else. He felt a fire igniting deep inside him, a desire to push forward no matter what. Inside the restaurant, things were buzzing as usual. The team had come in early to prepare for the lunch rush, and the atmosphere was filled with a quiet anticipation. Everyone was talking about the protest and the storm that had swept through their peaceful corner of the world. But there was an underlying sense of unity now, a shared belief that they had weathered the storm together and that they could handle whatever came next. James stepped away from the window and joined his staff in the kitchen, where the sound of chopping and sizzling filled the air. Chef Antonio gave him a nod of acknowledgement as he worked, and James could see the glint of respect in his eyes. Antonio had been one of the first people to offer support after the protest. He wasn't just a chef. He was a friend, and his loyalty meant everything to James. "You okay, boss?" Antonio asked without looking up from the stove, but there was a softness in his voice. James smiled and clapped him on the back. "I'm good. We're good. Just taking it all in. You know." Antonio paused for a moment and turned to face him. "I've been thinking," he said, his expression serious. "We're doing something important here. This restaurant is bigger than just food or wine. We're making a statement. We're changing the game." James nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "That's exactly it. But it's not just about the food. It's about a place where anyone can walk in and feel like they belong. It's about making the city better, one meal at a time." Antonio smiled and gave him a thumbs up. "We got your back, man. Don't forget that." With the kitchen humming along, James made his way to the front of the restaurant, where Sarah was organizing reservations for the evening. She looked up when he entered, and her face lit up with a smile. "I spoke to some of our regulars this morning," Sarah said. "They're all planning to come in tonight, show their support. The word is spreading. People want to be here." James's heart swelled with gratitude. "That's great to hear. I think we've turned a corner." But Sarah's expression shifted to one of concern. What about the others? The ones who were out there protesting yesterday? What if they come back? What if it gets worse? James took a deep breath and sat down across from her, his hands clasped in front of him. "It might, but I can't let that stop me. I've worked too hard to get here, and so has everyone else. We've built something important together, Sarah. And if some people can't accept it, then that's on them. But we're not backing down." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes filled with admiration. "I'm with you, James. We all are." The day passed without incident. The restaurant was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, and the laughter of guests who had come to enjoy their meals. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the tension of the previous days. James took a moment to appreciate the calm, knowing that this was the calm before the storm. That night, As he stood at the front of La Bellevue, greeting guests as they entered, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He could see the future of the restaurant unfolding before him, a future where inclusivity and innovation were at the heart of everything they did. As he shook hands with a familiar face, a regular customer who had been with him from the start, the man looked James in the eye and smiled. "You're doing something amazing here," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." James smiled back, his confidence growing with every word of encouragement. "Thanks. That means a lot." Later that evening, after the last guest had left, James sat in the empty restaurant, taking a moment to reflect. It had been a long road to get here, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, he was ready for whatever came his way. He stood up, looking around the space he had worked so hard to build. This was his restaurant now, and it was his vision that had shaped it. But more than that, it was a place where he could be proud of the impact it was having, not just on the culinary world, but on the community as a whole. La Bellevue was no longer just a restaurant. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of breaking down barriers that had stood for far too long. As James turned off the lights and locked the door for the night, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. The journey was far from over, but he knew now that he was ready to lead La Bellevue into its next chapter, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful victories.